March 9th, 1942, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The winter air stung the face of Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki as he stepped from the truck at the gate, his wrists loose at his sides, his eyes lowered to the gravel because the habit of shame felt heavier than any rope. He had been pulled from a narrow room, given a clean shirt that smelled of soap, and brought here with a small escort who spoke to him in careful words that he understood only in fragments. He saw a wooden guard tower against a pale sky, a fence that ran in a long square, and rows of barracks with neat numbers on the doors. He expected a blow, or a curse, or a spit on the ground at his feet. Instead, the first American he faced inside the gate was a middle-aged sergeant who said something that sounded like "welcome" and gestured with an open hand, palm down, as if calming a skittish horse. A second man, younger and thin, tried a bow that was too deep and awkward, then smiled in apology. They led Sakamaki across the yard, past a canteen window where steam fogged the panes, and the air carried the smell of coffee and baking bread. The men with him did not hurry. They did not prod him with the butt of a rifle. They walked as if this were any ordinary day. The surprise of it pressed on his chest. He had learned as a boy that captivity meant loss of honor and loss of life. He had repeated those lessons as an officer and had believed them on the morning of the attack, when his small craft grounded on the reef and his crewmen drowned in the surf. The lesson had not prepared him for the sight of a medical orderly who said good morning and handed him a folded towel. The orderly pointed toward a bench, then to a scale, then to a short doctor in spectacles who nodded and said his name with a gentle care for the syllables. Sakamaki was weighed, measured, and examined with brisk movements that did not humiliate. A young private recorded each number with a sharp pencil. They asked him to sit while they brought tea. When he lifted the cup, he saw his hand tremble. The tea was hot, a little weak, and he had to set it down. He breathed and counted his breaths. At the window, the orderly wiped a circle clear in the fog with his sleeve and let in a ribbon of cold light. The smile that came with that small act pierced him more than any harsh word could have done. He lowered his face and swallowed hard. The camp around him belonged to a larger story that had already set immense forces in motion. By early 1942, the United States Army had begun to adapt the network of cantonments that had trained troops in the previous war into a system to receive and hold prisoners under the Geneva Convention. On that March day, the camp command in Wisconsin followed a standard schedule of medical checks, name cards, and photographs that would be filed and cross-referenced. Across the country, the War Department tracked the numbers on wall charts that were updated each week. The wider POW population on American soil would reach a peak of more than 420,000 by mid-1945. The great majority of them German, with over 50,000 Italians and just under 4,000 Japanese in the continental United States. The pattern of capture shaped those totals. In the Pacific, the fighting was bitter and surrender was rare. Yet from the Aleutians to the Central Pacific, the trickle of prisoners never stopped. At the same time, the territories and islands under American control held many more Japanese prisoners, and these would be retained through the end of the war to dismantle military facilities and to clear airfields and depots. In that early spring, the small cluster at Camp McCoy had a special significance. The first Japanese naval officer taken alive after the attack on Hawaii had been moved away from the islands and away from the first shock of publicity. The Army believed the upper Midwest would be quiet soil for a careful program that paired basic security with steady, humane treatment. Inspections by medical officers were recorded in carbon copies for the files, and visits by the International Red Cross began to map a routine of food, clothing, mail, and work details that would be identical in form for every nationality in custody. The numbers were one part of the story. The habits inside the fence were another. A printed schedule listed reveille by bugle, breakfast at a set hour, a roll call, a period for exercise, and an evening light-out time that came early in winter and later in summer. The steam plant kept the barracks warm. The kitchens baked bread in large batches that perfumed the cold air all morning. The depot that served the camp received flour, meat, milk, and vegetables by the ton, and a ledger in the quartermaster office showed the daily draw in clean figures. Those figures had a quiet weight. They marked a standard that the guards saw as ordinary, and that many prisoners found hard to believe. In that place of schedules and ledgers, the next hour for Sakamaki unfolded in a series of small, steady shocks. He was issued a wool blanket and a clean shirt with block letters that marked his status. He was shown a bunk with a mattress that did not sag. There was a metal footlocker at the bed and a narrow shelf with a single book in English. He ran a hand along the board and felt the roughness of the grain under a thin layer of varnish. A guard pointed to the mess hall and made a simple sign for food. The line moved without noise. Trays slid forward, and men in white caps filled them with scoops measured by habit. He received bread, potatoes, a portion of meat with gravy, and a spoon of green beans that tasted of salt and were tender rather than soft. He watched the steam rise and doubted his place in this line. He waited for the moment when someone would pull him aside and take the tray away. No one did. A corporal came past with a coffee pot and tipped it at each cup with a flick of the wrist, then smiled and moved on. A chaplain in a dark collar stepped close, bowed his head in a sign of respect that did not presume any shared belief, and said nothing more than a greeting. At a table near the door, a clerk walked a prisoner through a form for outgoing mail. The card had a printed box that read, "I am well." Another box read, "I am in good health." The space for the address would take the name of a parent or spouse in Japan and would travel through an exchange of lists that linked Washington and Geneva to Tokyo. The idea that a message could move through that chain in wartime and return an answer to a wooden mailbox under a number on a Wisconsin barracks wall was almost beyond his imagination. His thoughts ran back to the shore near Bellows Field, to the surf that crushed his body, and to the sound of the explosion that never came, to the long hours in a small room where he spoke little and slept less. He had been sure that the road would end with anger or mockery. "Here," a private said "sir" by mistake, and corrected himself and blushed. The word cut him. He put down his fork and stared at his hands. The fingers shook again. He could not lift the cup until the tremor passed. He told himself to breathe, as he had been taught to breathe during training at Etajima. He whispered the words that framed the creed of service and tried to wrap himself in those words. But the smell of fresh bread and the sound of voices that were calm and the simple act of a guard stepping aside to make space for him in the line worked on him from all sides. When he finally rose from the table, he walked a slow circuit of the yard. The snow that had fallen a few days earlier was packed down to ice that made the boots sing with a faint crunch. He passed a chalkboard near the headquarters door, where a notice hung about a lecture on the rules for prisoners. The last line said, "There will be time for questions." He read it twice. In the light of midday, the distant hills were a mild blue. He had never seen this land. He did not know the names of the trees. He felt the ground under him as if it might shift. The day that pressed so hard on a single man sat within a global field of events that moved at speed. In the Pacific, American forces were still reeling from loss, yet they were shifting to a new posture. The Navy fought to control lines that reached far out from the West Coast to the Hawaiian chain and beyond. In the Aleutian Islands, Japanese units held Attu and Kiska, and in the spring of the following year, a campaign in brutal weather would retake them and send small groups of prisoners to American camps, including this one, by way of processing stations near San Francisco. The American Army was building a legal and administrative framework to hold every captive under rules that answered to the Geneva Convention of 1929. This meant regular inspections, the right to send and receive mail, access to medical care, and the assignment of work that was paid in canteen credits. The system in the United States had reached a scale that only a continental economy could sustain. By the time the national totals peaked, the camps and their branch sites numbered in the hundreds. Warehouses counted flour and sugar and meat in millions of pounds. Rail yards scheduled trains that delivered coal to heat barracks across entire states. Canteens recorded the sale of soap and stamps and writing paper in counts that ran into the thousands each month. In Wisconsin alone, the labor shortage during harvest would bring guards and groups of prisoners to fields that stretched in clean grids, where a single machine could do the work of many men. These facts did not make the war less cruel. They did not lift the embargo on news from home that haunted every prisoner. They did, however, give shape to a daily fact for a few thousand men from an island nation that had taught them to fear and hate the idea of surrender. The daily fact was this. Inside the wire, they received food on a schedule. They had heat in winter. They were addressed by name. They were treated for illness. They could write home. These were ordinary brushes of civilization to their captors. To the prisoners, they were a series of mercies that fell like blows. A guard who said, "Good morning," with a smile strained at the mind of a man who had prepared himself for scorn. An American officer who said, "Please sit," could break a resolve that had been set like stone. In such small moments, on such quiet days, the war worked its change. The change began with surprise, deepened to confusion, and then opened to grief. In that grief, many men discovered they could not hold their faces straight any longer. That was how a breakdown began in this camp. It began when the mind could no longer carry the weight of an old code that forbade tears, while the body felt a hand offer a cup of hot coffee and a clean blanket. The snow began to melt by late March, and the yard at Camp McCoy turned to a thin film of mud that clung to boots and froze again each night. Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki had been in the barracks for 3 weeks. The rhythm of the camp had settled into him in small ways that he did not admit aloud. He woke when the bugle sounded, folded his blanket, and stood by the bed until the roll was complete. The guards counted in English, and the Japanese interpreter repeated the numbers in his flat accent so the men could follow. After breakfast, Sakamaki swept the aisle between the bunks with slow strokes, listening to the scrape of broom bristles on the planks. He was assigned to light duty in the supply shed, where he stacked boxes of soap and folded canvas. The Americans paid him in canteen credits, 5 cents a day. It was not the money that confused him, but the fact that it existed at all. In Japan, a captured soldier was considered lost beyond redemption. Here, every man had a name, a number, and a record card filed in a cabinet that a clerk opened each morning. Sakamaki learned to say thank you and good evening because the guards seemed pleased when he tried. At first, his voice failed him, but the words came easier each week. He wrote a letter on a Red Cross card to his mother in Awa, using the formula they were taught. "I am well. I am being treated kindly." He stared at the page for a long time before adding a second line. "Do not worry about me." The camp censor would read it, but he wrote it anyway. When he handed it to the clerk, the man smiled again, the same open smile that still unsettled him. He bowed automatically, and the clerk bowed back without irony. The simplicity of it left Sakamaki trembling again. That night, he could not sleep. He lay on his bunk and listened to the wind pass under the eaves. Beyond the fence, the machinery of a nation at war was roaring into motion. By April 1942, American shipyards from San Francisco to Philadelphia were laying down keels at a rate that no enemy could match. In a single month, the Liberty Ship program produced 28 vessels, each capable of carrying 10,000 tons of cargo. Factories that had once built cars or refrigerators turned out trucks, tanks, and aircraft. Every figure on every chart pointed toward an acceleration that the Axis powers could neither understand nor stop. While Sakamaki swept the floor in the supply shed, dock workers in New Orleans loaded steel plate for ships that would cross the Atlantic in convoys, and farmers in Iowa planted grain that would feed armies on 3 continents. In Europe, the Wehrmacht pushed east into the Soviet Union, unaware that the very abundance Sakamaki now witnessed would soon tilt the balance of the entire war. The American government counted every prisoner as a responsibility under international law. Inspectors noted that rations for prisoners were to match those of U.S. troops training stateside, 3,500 calories per day, including meat, bread, milk, and vegetables. By summer, shipments of rice and tea arrived to provide food more familiar to the Japanese prisoners, though many refused it at first, out of pride. The War Department kept careful records. The cost of maintaining each prisoner averaged $1 per day, an amount that multiplied into millions across the expanding network of camps. To the men behind the wire, these statistics were invisible, yet they felt their weight in every full meal, every clean uniform, every polite word from a guard who saluted as if the war were a distant thing. As spring deepened, Sakamaki was moved to a different detail, assisting in the camp library. The small building smelled of paper and floor wax, and through its window he could see the flagpole where the stars and stripes hung at half-staff when news arrived of heavy American losses in the Pacific. The librarian, an older corporal with wire-rimmed glasses, noticed his interest in the photographs that lined the shelves. One afternoon, he pointed to a picture of the Grand Coulee Dam and said slowly, "Electric power, many lights." He traced the wires in the photograph with his finger. Sakamaki nodded, but could not find words. The image of that dam and its spillway of water, wider than any river in Japan, settled into his mind. The corporal took another photograph from a folder. Rows of B-17 bombers gleaming on a runway in Kansas, and said, "Each week, more." The statistics the corporal recited were staggering, even in simple language. Tens of thousands of planes, hundreds of thousands of tons of steel, millions of men in uniform. For Sakamaki, who had been told that America was soft and lazy, the evidence was a quiet avalanche. He began to understand why his interrogators in Honolulu had asked so many questions about Japanese morale rather than about weapons. They wanted to know what men believed, not just what they fought with. The librarian offered him an English primer. He took it, bowed, and carried it back to the barracks. At night, he traced each letter by the dim light of a bulb that burned longer than any lamp he had ever owned. In June, Camp McCoy received its first group of Japanese prisoners from the Aleutian Campaign. They arrived by train from Seattle, thin and silent, still dressed in torn winter uniforms. Sakamaki watched from the yard as they were marched past. Among them were men from Kiska and Attu, survivors of frostbite and hunger who had been captured after the American landings. Their faces were hollow, but their eyes flickered with defiance. He recognized the look. It was the same one he had worn when he first arrived. When they saw him standing freely, not beaten or bound, some turned away in disbelief. The newcomers were taken to quarantine barracks, where doctors examined them for lice and disease. They received clean clothing and were fed rice and bread until they could hold solid food again. A week later, Sakamaki was ordered to help distribute supplies to the new arrivals. One of the prisoners, a sergeant from the 301st Independent Infantry, stared at the American orderly who handed him soap and muttered, "They are mocking us." Sakamaki answered quietly, "No, it is real." The man blinked, uncertain whether to believe him. That night, several of the newcomers refused to eat. Others wept silently, unable to bear the contradiction between their expectations and the reality of kindness. The guards kept their distance, confused but patient. The reports sent to Washington later noted a deep psychological disorientation among Japanese prisoners, occasioned by humane treatment inconsistent with their indoctrinated expectations. For Sakamaki, it was no longer theory. He had lived through the first wave of that disorientation and now watched it unfold in others. He knew the tremor that came before tears, the struggle to reconcile discipline with the simple shock of a smile. By July 1942, the prairie around Camp McCoy had turned green, the wind carrying the smell of grass and new rain. Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki had now lived there for 4 months. The days no longer passed in terror, but in a quiet confusion that gnawed at him more deeply than fear. He had memorized the routine: morning roll call, breakfast, work, recreation, lights out. The sameness dulled his sense of time, yet small details pierced him. He began helping the camp interpreter teach basic Japanese phrases to guards. During those lessons, he saw something disarming: the Americans' effort to pronounce his language correctly. They laughed at their own mistakes, not at his. He corrected them, shyly at first, then more confidently. In the evenings, he joined the camp librarian, Corporal Harris, to translate headlines from English newspapers. Together, they read about battles at Midway and Guadalcanal. The reports were brief, but Sakamaki felt their weight. He had once believed Japan could never be defeated. Now he read of burning carriers and sinking cruisers. When Harris pointed at a map, Sakamaki saw a pattern: the vast distances, the endless sea lanes. He remembered the photograph of the dam, the fields of factories, and realized the same machine that fed him here was feeding a war effort that stretched across the planet. That thought filled him with a strange unease. His countrymen would die still believing America weak, but he had seen otherwise. That night, he sat on his bunk and opened the English primer again. The word printed at the top of the page was liberty. He traced each letter slowly, aware that he was learning a language his old self would have despised. Across the United States, the system of camps had expanded into a vast internal network. By autumn, the War Department operated more than 80 primary POW installations, from Maine to California, each with dozens of satellite camps. Prisoners harvested crops, felled timber, and built roads under guard. In Texas alone, more than 25,000 prisoners labored during the cotton harvest, their work recorded in ledgers that calculated output to the bushel. At the same time, the Japanese population in captivity remained small compared to the German and Italian numbers, yet their psychological condition drew intense attention from medical and intelligence officers. Reports from Wisconsin, Utah, and California described introverted, guilt-ridden captives displaying psychosomatic symptoms under continued humane treatment. The very absence of brutality confused them. American administrators debated whether leniency was effective or dangerous. The War Department's Bureau of Psychological Warfare commissioned quiet studies that compared Japanese responses to those of German prisoners. The findings noted that while Germans adapted by organizing social hierarchies within the camps, the Japanese tended to withdraw into silence. Some, like Sakamaki, adapted through compliance and learning, while others fell into melancholy or attempted self-harm. Each case reflected the collision between two moral universes, one built on obedience and honor, the other on individual worth and procedural fairness. The guards saw only quiet men in clean uniforms, but the files filling cabinets in Washington told a deeper story of minds unraveling not from cruelty, but from kindness. In September, an officer from the Office of the Provost Marshal General visited Camp McCoy to conduct interviews. Sakamaki was called to the administration building, where an interpreter and two officers waited. The room smelled of chalk and coffee. The senior officer asked questions slowly. Name, birthplace, naval rank, and opinion of his treatment. Sakamaki answered carefully, expecting a trap, but none came. They asked if he would cooperate in explaining Japanese customs to American personnel. He hesitated, then nodded. Later that week, he found himself standing before a small group of guards, describing how Japanese soldiers viewed capture as dishonor worse than death. He explained why many refused food or conversation. The men listened without ridicule. One asked, "So why are you alive?" The question pierced deeper than any interrogation could. He did not answer. That night, he wrote in his notebook, "They ask with curiosity, not hatred. I do not know what to feel." He tore out the page and burned it in a tin cup before lights out, but the words remained in his mind. Each act of courtesy, each gesture of respect, now felt like both mercy and punishment. The guard's humanity had become the mirror in which his own shame looked back at him. When new prisoners arrived in October, their hostility reminded him of who he had been. They called him traitor for speaking to Americans. Yet when one of them fell ill, he translated for the doctor. The doctor thanked him. The sick man recovered. The cycle repeated. Slowly, the camp's daily civility worked its erosion on all of them. By the end of 1942, the balance of the Pacific War had shifted. American industry was producing at levels beyond anything the world had known. 60,000 aircraft per year, 80,000 tanks, 2 million rifles, millions of tons of shipping. The Liberty shipyards that had once astonished Sakamaki in photographs were launching a new vessel every 3 days. Each one carried the food, equipment, and fuel that sustained not only the Allied armies, but the prisoners held within the country's interior. This scale of abundance formed the silent background of life at Camp McCoy. Trucks arrived weekly with supplies measured in tons, and the kitchens served meals that mirrored Army standards. Inspectors from the International Red Cross toured the camp that December and recorded no violations. One of them noted in his report that the Japanese prisoners appeared bewildered by good fortune. Their health was excellent, their mortality rate nearly zero, and discipline minimal. The broader statistics told the same story across the continent. Among all Axis prisoners in U.S. custody, Deaths from illness or injury remained under 1%, compared with rates above 10% in German and Japanese camps overseas. For men like Sakamaki, these numbers were invisible yet deeply felt. Each day they ate, walked, slept, and awoke to proof that their enemies lived by different principles than those taught to them since youth. The paradox broke some quietly and healed others slowly. For Sakamaki, it became a long education that he neither sought nor could escape. By early 1943, the snow returned to Wisconsin, covering the wire and the barracks roofs in a white so heavy that it muffled every sound. Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki had lived a year as a prisoner. The routines were now as familiar as the sound of his own breath. He swept the same aisle each morning, folded his blanket into the same square, and watched the same smoke rise from the kitchen chimney. Yet beneath that sameness, something was shifting inside him. He no longer trembled when guards spoke to him, no longer avoided their eyes. He even smiled once, a reflex he barely recognized. The camp received newspapers every few days, and though censors clipped out military details, Sakamaki could still piece together the rhythm of war. The Battle of Guadalcanal had ended with Japanese withdrawal. He read the name Midway again and again, and now he understood its scale. 4 Japanese carriers sunk, over 3,000 sailors lost. He sat in silence, his hands on the paper, thinking of classmates from the Naval Academy who would never return. He felt a weight of grief he could not share. The guards noticed his quietness, but said nothing. Later that week, he joined a work detail shoveling snow from the walkways. One of the guards, a man from Ohio, leaned on his shovel and said through the interpreter, "Spring will come soon." The simple kindness of the phrase, its calm certainty, struck Sakamaki harder than any insult could have. He looked at the endless white field and thought that perhaps it would. Across the Pacific, events were tightening around Japan. The industrial power that Sakamaki had glimpsed in the photographs of American factories was now pouring into the war at full strength. In 1943 alone, the United States produced 86,000 aircraft, nearly 9 times the total Japan managed. Shipyards launched an average of 3 Liberty ships each day, each one built in less than 2 weeks. Millions of men were now in uniform, while millions more worked in steel, coal, and oil. Even in the middle of the American heartland, where Sakamaki lived behind the fence, this vast machine touched everything. Trains pulled into the siding at Camp McCoy each week, carrying food, coal, and medical supplies. Record books in the quartermaster's office tracked quantities in exact figures. 9,200 loaves of bread per month, 5,000 pounds of meat, 10,000 gallons of milk. The precision of it was part of its power. War for the Americans was not chaos, but mathematics. Inspectors from Washington moved from camp to camp, ensuring compliance with Geneva Convention rules. Each report recorded calories, sanitation, temperature, and medical access. When an influenza outbreak swept through the Midwest that spring, vaccination teams visited every prisoner, Japanese and German alike. Deaths were nearly non-existent. The sheer efficiency of this invisible system, the way it treated even enemies as subjects of care, was more devastating to Japanese beliefs than any bomb. The men who received that care had been taught that capture made them subhuman. Yet here they were, measured, fed, and healed by the same people they had been told were beasts. Sakamaki's quiet transformation became visible to those around him. The guards trusted him with small responsibilities, distributing mail, organizing tools, translating simple instructions. He learned enough English to write short notes. The other prisoners began to come to him for help, though some still resented his cooperation. One afternoon, a younger prisoner, a corporal from Nagasaki, refused to eat, insisting he would die before accepting food from an enemy. Sakamaki sat beside him and said softly, "If you die, Japan gains nothing. If you live, you can remember." The man stared at him and finally took a bite. Sakamaki carried the memory of that moment for days. It was not victory, but something quieter, an understanding that survival itself could hold meaning. He began to assist in literacy lessons that the Americans organized to pass the time. The classes included German and Italian prisoners as well, and the mixture of accents filled the hall with sound. The instructor, a Methodist chaplain, used simple words about peace and redemption. Sakamaki listened, not to convert, but to understand. He realized the man spoke without hatred. Each lesson closed with a short prayer that the chaplain translated into plain English. "May we be guided toward wisdom." The sentence struck Sakamaki more deeply than the prayer itself. Wisdom, he thought, might mean seeing clearly even when one's own beliefs crumble. By mid-1943, the War Department began transferring small groups of Japanese prisoners from Camp McCoy to other sites in Texas, Louisiana, and California to assist with agricultural labor. Each move was recorded and new files opened. Nationwide, the number of Axis prisoners working in American fields reached nearly 100,000, their labor valued at over $200 million by the end of the war. The reports described Japanese workers as meticulous, efficient, and quiet. Sakamaki remained in Wisconsin to serve as an interpreter for new arrivals. His role placed him between two worlds: the disciplined silence of the prisoners and the pragmatic calm of the guards. He felt belonging to neither. At night, he read more English books, including one with black and white photographs of the American countryside. Vast fields, rivers, towns. The scale unsettled him again. He realized that what had broken the German prisoner's pride was the shock of defeat. But what was breaking the Japanese prisoner's spirit was the shock of decency. Each meal, each kind word, chipped away at their armor. They could no longer believe that the enemy was barbaric. They could not understand how a nation so strong could also be so merciful. When summer came, and the first wildflowers appeared outside the fence, Sakamaki watched them nod in the wind and thought that his captors had mastered not only war, but the strange art of peace. Autumn 1943 arrived with a wind that carried the smell of harvest and coal smoke. Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki had now been in American custody for over 18 months. The rhythm of his captivity had long become steady, but inside he sensed a growing disquiet that he could not name. He had survived the first year of disbelief and the slow surrender of pride, yet something deeper had begun to stir, a fragile curiosity about the country that held him. Each week he was assigned to interpret letters, forms, and inspection reports between Japanese prisoners and camp administrators. These papers revealed more than their words. Lists of issued blankets, soap rations, work shifts, and canteen transactions that showed the Americans tracked every prisoner as if each were part of a precise machine. He once overheard a colonel say that by the end of the year, there would be nearly 400,000 Axis prisoners on U.S. soil. The number seemed beyond comprehension. How could a single nation feed, clothe, and house an army of enemies while still fighting across oceans? When he translated that figure for another prisoner, the man laughed bitterly and said, "They must be gods." Sakamaki said nothing, but he knew that it was not divinity. It was organization. That realization frightened him more than any weapon. At the same time, the United States had reached the height of its wartime expansion. The year's production statistics filled newspapers. 87,000 aircraft, nearly 90,000 tanks and armored vehicles, and hundreds of millions of artillery shells. American shipyards launched more tonnage in 1943 than Japan had built in the entire war. These numbers filtered into the camp through newspapers and Red Cross bulletins. They were not propaganda. They were records. To men who had been told that the United States was a nation of soft dreamers, such figures felt like an earthquake under their beliefs. That fall, Camp McCoy received shipments of canned food, medical supplies, and clothing to prepare for winter. Every delivery bore stamps from depots thousands of miles away: Chicago, Detroit, New York. The train schedules, the precision of the paperwork, the punctuality of supply, all these reminded Sakamaki of what Japan lacked. He had grown up in a country that prized discipline, yet could not match this scale of coordination. In one of his letters home, he wrote, "America's strength is not cruelty, but abundance." He knew the censor would read it, but he sent it anyway. When his mother's reply came 6 months later, she said only, "We pray that you see your homeland again." He touched the paper for a long time before folding it back into the envelope. Inside the camp, the changes in spirit among the prisoners were unmistakable. Some men who had once sworn never to speak to the Americans now played baseball in the yard using improvised bats. Others worked in the garden plots that bordered the fence, growing cabbages and carrots to supplement the rations. The guards encouraged this, noting the improvement in morale. The Japanese prisoners, who had been told that defeat was worse than death, began to understand survival as a form of duty rather than disgrace. Yet with that understanding came pain. The weight of shame did not lift easily. At night, men cried softly, ashamed not of capture, but of gratitude. The guards treated these moments with silence and respect. They had been instructed never to mock, never to gloat. An official report filed from Camp McCoy to Washington in November 1943 noted that Japanese prisoners display signs of emotional breakdown in response to unexpected humane treatment. The phrase appeared clinical on paper, but in the barracks it meant men sitting on their bunks staring at nothing, whispering prayers to no one. Sakamaki often sat among them, translating what they could not say. He understood now that compassion could break a man faster than punishment. By Christmas, the camp had become a small reflection of America itself. Civilians from nearby towns sent boxes of gifts: chocolate, cigarettes, small handmade cards. Local church choirs performed carols outside the fence, their voices carrying over the snow. The prisoners stood in silence as they listened. Some bowed their heads, others turned away, unable to bear the kindness. The guards served a special meal that evening: turkey, potatoes, vegetables, and apple pie. Sakamaki ate slowly, each bite heavy with disbelief. When a young American guard said, "Merry Christmas," in halting Japanese, he felt tears sting his eyes. He turned away quickly, ashamed that kindness could undo him so completely. Later that night, he wrote in his diary, "They smile because they can. We do not know how." He realized that his captors' greatest weapon was not power or wealth, but the ease with which they showed humanity. The prisoners, raised in a system where mercy was weakness, had no defense against it. As the snow fell again and the camp lights glowed against the dark, Sakamaki lay awake and thought of home. He did not know what Japan would look like when he returned, or whether he would ever return at all. But he understood now that the war was already lost. not only on the battlefield, but in the hearts of those who had seen what a free and confident nation could build. Spring 1944 came late to Wisconsin. The snow melted in heavy, wet clumps, leaving behind a field of dark soil where the first blades of grass pushed through for Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki. This second spring in captivity felt strangely quiet. The guards had changed. Younger ones now filled the towers, their faces fresh from training. They treated the prisoners with the same calm discipline as their predecessors. By now, Sakamaki no longer startled at voices in English or the clang of the mess hall bell. His world had become measured in predictable rhythms: letters from home every few months, the distant whistle of freight trains, the crack of baseball bats in the recreation yard. But inside, something irreversible had happened. He had lost the belief that Japan could win the war. That loss was not born of defeat in combat, but from observation. Every day he saw a nation that built with precision, while others destroyed themselves through ideology. The camp's electricity never failed. Its water ran clean. Its food arrived on schedule. Each of these things seemed small, yet together they formed a truth stronger than propaganda. He realized that the war's outcome had been decided long before the first bomb fell, decided by industry, organization, and the sheer capacity of a free society to multiply its effort. Outside the wire, the tide of war was turning decisively. American factories now produced aircraft faster than they could be deployed, tanks faster than they could be shipped. The U.S. Army Air Forces controlled the skies over Europe, and in the Pacific, new fleets of carriers and bombers advanced toward Japan's outer defenses. At the same time, America's home front reached an industrial climax. Nearly 70 million citizens were employed, and war production had reached levels no empire in history had matched. The War Department's Prisoner of War Division recorded that by mid-1944, 430,000 Axis prisoners were held across the United States. Of these, fewer than 10,000 were Japanese, but their psychological profiles continued to draw interest. Reports described how exposure to American society, not propaganda, produced gradual ideological erosion. Japanese captives, steeped in Bushido and the cult of death before dishonor, were beginning to question the foundations of that belief. One intelligence officer wrote, "For many, a smile has done more than interrogation." At Camp McCoy, Sakamaki saw this firsthand. A sergeant who once shouted that he would rather starve than serve the enemy now volunteered in the kitchen. Another who had torn up his first Red Cross letter now read the English Bible to practice pronunciation. The shift was subtle but constant. It was not conversion, but awakening. By summer, the camp introduced education programs at the request of the War Department. Classes in English, agriculture, and mechanics were offered under supervision. Sakamaki was invited to assist in translation, bridging the words of the instructors and the hesitant questions of his countrymen. One afternoon, he sat in a classroom with 20 other prisoners while an American engineer drew a diagram of a tractor engine on the chalkboard. The engineer explained how mechanized farming had transformed rural America, producing enough food to feed not only its own people but entire armies abroad. Sakamaki translated line by line, his voice steady, but his mind reeled at the numbers: acres measured in the thousands, yields counted in millions of bushels. Japan, with its narrow islands and hand labor, could never match such abundance. After class, the engineer offered him a small book on American industry, its pages filled with photographs of assembly lines, power stations, and vast warehouses stacked to the ceiling. Sakamaki studied it late into the night. Each image was both wonder and wound. The factories gleamed with light, their workers smiling, their production effortless. He understood that these photographs were not made to humiliate him, yet they carried a silent message. This was what freedom looked like when turned into work. As 1944 drew on, the war approached Japan itself. American submarines choked shipping routes, and Allied bombers began to strike industrial cities. News arrived through censored newspapers, yet even stripped of detail, the meaning was clear. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, each name appeared beside words like fire, damage, and civilian casualties. The prisoners read these reports in silence. Some prayed, others turned away. Sakamaki could not decide whether the pain he felt was grief or inevitability. That December, he stood outside the barracks one evening and watched snow fall through the searchlights. The glow made the flakes look like drifting ash. In the distance, a guard was humming a tune he did not recognize. It reminded him of home, though the words were foreign. He thought of the men still fighting, of the families waiting, and of the strange mercy that had spared him to witness all this. Inside the barracks, someone began singing softly in Japanese, a song from before the war about cherry blossoms falling. Others joined until the room filled with quiet harmony. The guards did not interrupt. For a moment, the line between captor and captive vanished, replaced by something fragile and human. Sakamaki listened, his throat tight. He realized that even in defeat, they had been given something unexpected, a lesson in dignity from those who had no reason to grant it. By the summer of 1945, the world Sakamaki had known no longer existed. The war that had begun with shouts of victory and drums of destiny had dissolved into silence and ash. At Camp McCoy, the rhythm of life continued, but beneath it ran an undercurrent of tension. Rumors spread among the prisoners. Germany had surrendered in May. Some guards smiled more often now. Others seemed distant, their minds already turning homeward. For the Japanese, the war still burned across the Pacific. Letters from home arrived less frequently and bore marks of censorship and despair. Sakamaki read one from his mother that said, "The nights are full of noise. We hide when the sirens sound." He folded it carefully and placed it beneath his mattress. In those months, he worked on an agricultural detail outside the camp, tending rows of corn taller than he had ever seen. The fields stretched beyond sight, a green ocean that symbolized America's endless capacity to feed itself and others. When he stood there beneath the open sky, he felt both awe and sorrow. He understood now that a nation that could grow this much food while fighting across two oceans could never be defeated. It was not just technology or weapons. It was confidence. It was the quiet certainty that tomorrow would always bring more. In July, American newspapers carried the first reports of an extraordinary weapon tested in the New Mexico desert. The guards whispered about it with unease, though no one yet understood what it meant. Then, in early August, the news reached Camp McCoy in plain black type. Hiroshima destroyed. 3 days later, Nagasaki. The prisoners gathered near the bulletin board, staring at the brief notices clipped from newspapers. There were no photographs, only words. Atomic bomb. Tens of thousands killed. Entire city flattened. For a long time, no one spoke. Some turned away. Others wept quietly. Sakamaki felt as though his heart had stopped. He knew Nagasaki. He knew men from that city. One of them had sat beside him during his first weeks of capture. That night, the camp was silent except for the faint hum of power lines overhead. He thought of the American guards, who still treated them with courtesy, offering cigarettes and clean water. The contradiction was unbearable. The same country that had just unleashed unimaginable destruction still greeted its prisoners with kindness. It was not hypocrisy, he realized. It was strength beyond comprehension. A nation so sure of its power that it did not need cruelty. On August 15, 1945, the announcement came. Japan had surrendered. The guards assembled the prisoners in formation and stood before them as the camp commander read a statement from Washington. "Hostilities have ceased," he said, his voice solemn. The translator repeated the words in Japanese. For a moment, no one moved. Then an older prisoner fell to his knees and began to sob. Others followed, not in relief but in a kind of spiritual collapse. For men who had been raised to die before surrender, hearing that their emperor had accepted defeat was like losing the sun itself. Some cried out. Others stood in silence with vacant eyes. Sakamaki felt tears slide down his face, though he did not know why. Grief, guilt, or perhaps something more complicated. The guards did not cheer. They removed their caps, bowed their heads, and walked quietly among the men, offering water and words of comfort that none could understand. In the weeks that followed, the camp became a place of suspended time. No one knew what would happen next. Repatriation lists were drawn up, medical exams conducted, papers signed. Yet the air felt heavy with unspoken emotion. The men who had once cursed the Americans now looked at them with a strange reverence. When the first trains began carrying prisoners to the coast that autumn, Sakamaki stood by the wire and watched the engines puff white smoke into the gray sky. He knew he would soon be on one of them. His name appeared on a roster pinned to the notice board. Sakamaki, Kazuo, return to Japan. He folded his blanket, packed the few belongings he had, and looked once more at the camp that had been his world for more than 3 years. The barracks, the yard, the flagpole, all symbols of captivity, had become, paradoxically, the place where he had discovered what freedom meant. As the trucks rolled out toward the railhead, he caught a final glimpse of the American guards standing by the gate. One raised his hand in farewell. Without thinking, Sakamaki bowed deeply. When the train moved south, he watched the countryside pass in a blur of green and gold. Fields, rivers, towns, an endless landscape of order and plenty. He thought of the men who would return home broken, of the cities that no longer existed, and of the strange truth that he would carry forever, that the people who had captured him had taught him the value of mercy,